when I was a senior in college, I took a debate course, which is pretty edifying. We learned basic principles of rhetoric, how to organize evidence for a case, what sorts of sources to go to for geopolitics and such. Did a lot of browsing JSTOR. It was certainly enjoyable, and I was also in the debate club that year. It's something that I'd really like to do again, because, I don't know, it's valuable to exercise that argumentative ability. You have to really put your reps in, and I do like arguing both sides of a case and just studying the rhetorical aspect of it for its own sake. Whereas when you engage in debate online, it's usually, I am entrenched in this position, you are entrenched in yours, and more than anything else, it tends to be about, taking some of the other person's audience and that sort of thing. So anyway, one of the things that I had to do in this debate course was give an argument for or against intervention in Syria. So this was right at the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And I argued for intervention because I thought the best argument that I could come up with was that America has to take steps to preserve global hegemony because there is the threat of nuclear war. And if we don't play that grand chessboard and marginalize rogue states, we might end up with nuclear proliferation and a greater chance of human extinction. And since humanity might live for millions more years and colonize the galaxy, there's a lot of lost human potential if we allow ourselves to go extinct. So compared to the costs of military intervention, if we can reduce the chance of human extinction by 0.1%, that ultimately weighs the worth of billions of human lives versus, maybe 1 million casualties of war or something like that. So when I was done giving my presentation, the professor said, so basically the neoconservative argument. And I wasn't aware of this at the time, that I was basically giving the Brzezinski doctrine, but it certainly has a point, right? We could go extinct based on nuclear war, or some super virus, bioengineered super virus, nanotech gone amok. There are a lot of ways that we could actually kill ourselves. And to neglect this possibility is basically reckless. I didn't take the argument that seriously when I was in college. I just picked it because I thought it was a winning argument and the kind of thing you would use in debate class. But now that I have kids and I'm actually thinking about the future of this planet, how do you not seek to maximize the chance of overall human survival over and above the interests of national sovereignty or any kind of localist, parochial, tribal, aesthetic, cultural affiliations? Right? All of those things are dispensable. They're contingent. They have to do with a particular time and place, and all of them are dependent on the existence of humanity in the first place. And so the existence of humanity necessarily takes priority over, the ability of Syria to set its own policy objectives, or the ability of Iran to develop a nuclear energy program. So the topic for this week is nationalism. Does it have a future? Can it have a future? And there are a few different angles to look at here. I think the most powerful is this question of human survival. Is it possible in the long run, over thousands of years, to have a multipolar world of advanced sovereign nations? Right? There's two different aspects to this. Nationalism is a sentiment. It's a cultural preference. It's an instinct to a certain extent. It's an extension of our preference for our kin group. And to that extent, there's nothing inherently wrong with having those preferences or organizing voluntarily on that basis. But nationalism as a political structure is not this kind of human, universal, instinctual thing. It is an outgrowth of the modern era. The ethno-state is basically the model of the 1848 revolutions. I mean, like the French identity, the national identity of France, for example, was a political construct. It was a construct of the enlightened despots and their ability to suppress regional autonomy. They did that through force and created the French national identity. So when I say, does nationalism have a future, I'm not talking about, will races continue to exist? Will ethnic groups continue? Of course they will. That's evolution. That's simply how it will work. Even if we homogenized here by some kind of globalist multicultural program, by the time, if we ever did colonize different planets, over thousands of years, we would just differentiate again. So that aspect is eternal, but there's something about the national political structure that's historically contingent and not necessarily something that will lend itself to long-term human survival. So the rogue state argument is, if a rogue state can develop some kind of super weapon that could threaten the species, how can we possibly prevent this? And going forward in time, you have different rogue regimes for thousands. Right now there are 3 or 4 significant rogue states: North Korea, Iran, I guess Syria still technically, but states that don't fit into the overarching world order. Arguably Israel is one of those, judged not from an American perspective, but from an international perspective. So you have a few rogue states, like the Samson option, that threatens human survival. You have a few rogue states now, in one period of time, say regimes last, 60 years, or make the math simpler, 100 years, over 1,000 years, you have 5 rogue states per century. That's 50 rogue states. And as time goes on, it'll be easier for a rogue state to develop a nuke or develop any kind of super weapon. So that's 50 chances in just 1,000 years that some rogue, politically sovereign unit will threaten the existence of humanity. As you go on in time, this threat exponentially increases because technology continues to advance. It makes it more likely that a rogue state could, in principle, develop some kind of super weapon. So this is an argument for political globalism. Sovereignty means the right to go to war. Can we allow nation states the right to go to war indefinitely? That's the first argument. And to me, it seems fairly cut and dry, right? Are you going to argue that it's impossible for a rogue state to build a super weapon that could threaten the species? I don't see the basis for that. Just epistemologically, even if we don't have a weapon that could kill ourselves today, like you want to argue that nukes aren't real or something, what's to say that in 50 years we won't discover some new technology that could threaten the species? So arguing for the impossibility of an unforeseen tech is pretty difficult. We can see the trends in, growing capacities for destruction by our own hands. So just extrapolating that trend as it exists seems to lead to this world of possible catastrophe. So yeah, like I said, that's the first argument for globalism against political nationalism. Again, ethnic nationalism, sentiments, the way that we organize voluntarily, these sorts of things, that's another matter. And there's also the idea of a kind of global federation, a confederated model where political sovereignty in an absolute sense only exists at the level of some kind of global government, but within that global government there are different federal states that have a limited degree of autonomy, not including weapons programs, military expeditions, and so forth. So if you want to call that nationalism, fine. I don't really have a problem with that. But the concept that I'm really arguing against is full-blown sovereign nations, multipolar sovereign nations existing into the future. It seems to me to lead to human extinction in all likelihood. So that's the first argument. The second argument is when you have multiple nations, everything becomes weaponized. You end up getting full spectrum warfare, including cultural warfare, including economic warfare, and this creates perverse incentives for one nation state to meddle in the affairs of another nation state and reduce the quality of life. We see this happening now. That's why Iran is so poor. That's partially why Russia is so poor. I mean, U.S. foreign intervention is a prime example of that in the interest of the U.S. state, and not just the state, but obviously the elites who are behind it and behind other governments as well. But in the interest of preserving that power structure, they intervene all over the world. They pump out toxic media that demoralizes, that makes us more docile, easy to control, pleasure addicted, all these things. This is a perverse incentive created by the need for a national government to preserve its sovereignty. As long as power structures exist that wish to preserve their sovereignty, this incentive for cultural and economic manipulation will persist. That is undesirable in my mind. How can you have nations coexisting that don't end up trying to suppress one another to increase the likelihood of each of their own individual survival? If you play one of the civilization games, this is something that you want to do. You want to suppress your rivals. You want to raid early, not necessarily for full domination, but, like pillage their tiles, capture their settlers, this sort of thing. Persistent, perpetual warfare, economically, militarily, culturally. That's what you need to do to preserve your political structure. Political structures want to preserve themselves. They will do what it takes and meddle in the affairs of other nations to survive. So that's the second point. The third point is related to this, but applied to their own populations. Because even if seemingly at face value the nation exists, this kind of nationalist sovereignty exists for the interest of that real organic biological nation, that's not who ends up making decisions. The nation, the biological nation as a whole, is a kind of deterministic mass, right? The agents of change are the people within some kind of political power structure, within institutions. And when you think of the nation state, really what you're talking about is a power structure that has laid down a physical grid of infrastructure, of places where they keep weapons, places where they generate their power. Like all of the physical infrastructure of the state is distributed as a grid, a physical grid laid across terrain. That structure is what ends up wanting to preserve itself. The people attached to that structure, who derive their livelihood off of that structure. That's who wants to survive. The nation as a whole is the abstraction that's used to justify the existence of the sovereignty of those attached to this grid that we call the state. So this means that this power structure will have an incentive to decrease the ability of members of the organic nation not associated with the state, decrease their ability to interfere in state affairs, reduce the possibility of revolution, reduce really truly democratic influences increases the incentive to spread propaganda, to brainwash the masses, to surveil them, because that's the only way to maximize the odds of survival of the regime. Continuity of government. And we see in certain policies that do exist that continuity of government takes precedence over any supposed democratic justification for the state. Right? Even if a majority of the citizens took up arms against the state, they would take drastic measures to ensure that this grid, this power structure, persists and continues into the future. So, yeah, that's kind of that third point. The nation ends up being the slave to the nation state, because the nation state is not simply an expression of the national spirit, as Hegel naively thinks. This, it's very unrealistic. No, I mean, the kind of Juvenalian power analysis where the center wants to preserve its sovereignty like that, that's fairly accurate. That's the way states actually work in real life. So when you have a nation state where the power is, weak or not firmly established, this means they're going to continue trying to suppress the middle, suppress those who could potentially in the future resist their authority. So there's also the factor of competing economically into the future. You want to increase the economic output that you can get from your citizens without real concern for their quality of life. Like, if China wants to dominate globally, they should continue doing what they're doing, which is basically breeding people to be the optimal economic unit. Chinese people are very willing to submit to the authority of their corporation to put up with what we would consider to be intolerable working conditions. And that should be the trend in the long run. The more that you can get out of your citizens, the more your nation is likely to survive as a sovereign unit. So it just doesn't lend itself, this kind of national competition, to an increase in quality of life. So I'm willing to hear other perspectives on this. And if you have strong thoughts, I'll have the link to Peer Academy in the description. You can click on that and join the discussion list. I send out pairs, random pairs, so that you have someone who's interested in this to talk to about it, have a nice in-depth conversation, and then next Saturday in the morning, let's say 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll have a group chat in my Discord, and I will say, if you join the Peer Academy, I will send you, upon request, a link to join the Discord. And I know the link is floating around in different places anyway. So if you have a different perspective, go ahead. I'll also link a thread on the forum, which is dedicated to this discussion topic. Is there a future for nationalism? Those three main arguments that the existence of multiple nations means a greater likelihood of the development of a superweapon, and compared to a global government with one center of power, that threat is much larger. Yes, a global government could still destroy itself, but there's more incentive for multiple nation states that have enemies to develop more and more dangerous weapons as deterrents or for offensive capabilities. A global government that is firmly secure, basically a global tyranny, has less incentive to develop super weapons because they can't be removed from the center. They are firmly established. And so in the interest of long-term human survival, it seems that the best political arrangement for the planet should be a permanent global government that has no chance of being dethroned. Of course, we don't like that idea because the people occupying that sort of position today seem to be against the aesthetic preferences that we hold and sometimes the moral preferences. It seems to be pushing this kind of individualism, materialism, all sorts of aspects of modern life that are distasteful to some of us. We don't want them to be in charge forever. But you also have to look at, like, are they pushing this stuff because that's their genuine preference, or are they pushing it in this kind of high-low versus middle struggle? What's their incentive in pushing the kind of modernity that we see? But it may be that they aren't the ones who remain in the center if it's ever solidified. And unless we discuss how we would like the world to be, what a global government should look like, and how we can provide something like checks and balances as exists in the US Constitution, provide some kind of mechanism for ensuring that those who gravitate towards the center of the global power structure don't just become lords over the rest of us. Like, how can you do that? What are institutions that you can put in place? What's the structure of power at a global scale that will allow for maximum individual liberty, I guess, or the liberty of ethnic groups, or the liberty of whatever? And that's kind of a different discussion topic. Like, what's the appropriate level of liberty? Nationalists want sovereignty, liberty for the nation. Tribalists for the tribe, individualists for the individual. So that's maybe a discussion topic for the future. But anyway, those are my arguments against nationalism. I don't think it can work long term. I know there are still people out there calling themselves nationalists, but you should note that, like, if you're a Christian, you can't really be a nationalist, because even the Christians want a global government, right? That's the telos of the Christian faith, to have a global dominion of logos. And I'm okay with that. A permanent global government that actually accords with reason and leads us towards the good and towards God, well then fine. That's kind of the biblical deal. That's what we're looking for. And other religions prophesy it too. So this is an interesting topic. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.